Good morning and welcome to Green at Core. I've always loved spot the difference pictures. I could spend hours looking at pictures trying to find the difference between two seemingly identical pictures. Some of the differences are very stark and easy to see, but there are other differences that are so subtle they seem unnoticeable. There's such a great satisfaction when you suddenly spot the difference. Recently, I've been thinking about a character in the Bible who was very different in his faith and the way that he lived his life. It wasn't different in a hard to spot or very subtle difference. His difference was so obvious that it attracted attention and a few enemies. That character is Daniel. Often, when we think about Daniel, we simply think about his experience in the lion's den. But Daniel's journey to be different for God starts before this. And in chapter 1 of the book of Daniel, it says this. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and he put the treasures in the house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court's officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief officials for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice of food and the wine that they were drinking and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to those 4. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now, I find this chapter really interesting. Nebuchadnezzar was a clever tactician. By taking the cream of the crop of the young men, he was leaving the captive people weaker. And by training them in his court, he was ensuring that the captive people wouldn't consider rebelling against them. The king's plan to change their name, ensure they eat different food, and making sure they were educated in what he wanted them to know. He made sure that the people that he chose would be indoctrinated, renouncing their culture and ultimately their gods. We read that the king changed Daniel's name to Belshazzar. Now the name Daniel means God is my judge, and it was changed to Belshazzar, which means Bel's prince. Now Bel was a national god of Babylon. He was a false god. In this name change, we see the battle that will take place later. The culture of the day was saying, bow to our false god, be a son of this world. And Daniel was saying, no, I'm Daniel. God is my judge. Daniel chose to make a stand for God in seemingly small and simple things. He wanted to remain faithful to God, and he knew that by eating the food that was offered, he would make himself unclean. And so he chose to be different, and he requested that he didn't eat the food. He was aware that God touched every part of his life, and therefore there wasn't a part of his life that could be compromised. Now Daniel and his friends agreed to eat a vegetarian diet instead of the food given by the palace, and God honoured their decision to be different by not only sustaining them, but by making them more nourished and better than anyone else. Not only that, God then gave them gifts and skills that they could use in the future for his glory. Now this is by no means the end of the story for the people mentioned. Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, faced persecution and trials in the future. However, like we see in Daniel's story, they chose to dare to be different and live for God, and they saw mighty miracles of protection. Now in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, we read the famous story of Daniel's night with the lion. Daniel was doing brilliantly in his job, and he was making a positive impression on his bosses, so he was set for a big promotion. This made the people around him really jealous, and so they began to look for skeletons in his closet that they might use to bring him down. But no matter how hard they looked, they found nothing. They knew one thing about Daniel, and that was he would be faithful to his God under any circumstances. That was the only way they could bring him down. Now this is a bit of a challenge for each of us today. One commentator said this: the world may not know the details of doctrine or the intimacies of worship with God, but they can tell a bad temper, selfishness, conceitedness, or dishonesty when they see it. The world is a very poor critic of my Christianity, but is a very sufficient one of my conduct. The challenge is, how different are we really to the world? Like Daniel, is the only thing people can find wrong with us the fact that we love Jesus? So anyway, Daniel's enemies set a trap and manipulated the king into making a law to make worshipping any other god or man apart from him illegal for 30 days. The punishment was death by the lion pit. Daniel, however, chose to be different to the world. He refused to neglect his relationship with God, and his immediate response was to pray to him. He continued to worship God as he always had. Daniel's enemies took advantage of this, and so he was brought before the king for not obeying this new law, and was to be punished. Now the king wasn't very happy with this, and tried to find a way out, but there wasn't any. He had no choice but to throw him into the lion's den. Now I love the fact that the king had an awful night, knowing that he sent Daniel to his death. However, God was doing miracles, and Daniel remained safe. Daniel, in fact, had a pretty good night. Spurgeon puts it this way: in any case, he must have had a glorious night. What with the lions and the angels all night to keep him company, he was spending the night watches in grander style than the king, Darius. At the end of this story, we see a great truth that we see spread throughout the Bible, and it's summed up well in Romans 8:28. It says, "So we are convinced that every detail of our lives is continually woven together for good, for we are his lovers and have been called to fulfill his designed purpose." The enemy was defeated, and so much more than that. The king decreed that God is God, and he gave testimony to what he'd seen. He declared that people should worship the God who had saved Daniel. What the enemy meant for evil, God turned around to so much good. Daniel made a choice to be different to the world. It wasn't an easy road, and it came at a cost. However, he knew that it was the right choice to make. This is the choice that each of us face in our own lives. When we choose to follow Jesus, we choose to be different. A life sold out to Christ is not always easy, and it doesn't come without opposition. But it is so worth it. Now, there's a song in the Salvation Army songbook that I used to love to sing in Sunday school when I was a child. It talked about the choice that Daniel made, and a choice that we each face today. The lyrics go like this: standing by a purpose true, heeding God's commands, honour them, the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's bands. Many mighty men are lost, daring not to stand, who for God had been a host by joining Daniel's bands. Many giants, great and tall, stalking through this land, headlong to the earth would fall if met by Daniel's bands. Hold the gospel banner high, on to victory grand, Satan and his host defy, and shout for Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, and dare to make it known. What a powerful song! It's far more than a catchy song to sing in Sunday school. For each of us, we have a decision to dare to be a Daniel and consider what that might look like in our own lives. We live in a world where the enemy seems to be winning. The voice of God seems to be drowned out by people shouting, "Do what you feel like doing. Don't rock the boat. Everybody's right." What would daring to be a Daniel look like here? We live in community where the enemy seems to be winning. Addiction, fear, loneliness is rife. There are people that are seen as too lost to deserve help. What would daring to be a Daniel look like here? We all have relationships where the enemy seems to be winning. We live with relationships that are broken. What would daring to be a Daniel look like here? We're called to be different to the world that we're living in, to pray for those around us, to expect God to do miracles, and that those things meant for our downfall will become something that will bring God glory. Today, the challenge is, how can I be a Daniel in the situations we find ourselves in?
I dare